Your goal as a parent is to raise a kid that you actually want to spend time being around. The problem is that you conveniencing yourself does the exact opposite. It produces this little gremlin that you don't want to be around. On the podcast this week, we're going to talk on a hot subject, which is children's nutrition. Some things that you never thought about, and some ways to navigate what is quite possibly one of the hardest parts of being a parent. Three, two, one. I have kept quiet on this topic for as long as I possibly can. I think I don't want to be polarizing. I don't want to ever say something that would offend, but it's come up often enough where I feel like we got to address it. A very common sentiment that I hear, not just here at the gym, but as a parent myself, is how hard it is to make good choices because of all of the kids' food that's in the house. That one statement tells me that we are so dysfunctionally set up to address that question, not only for yourself, but for your children, that we need to have a big old discussion about nutrition for kids. We talk a lot about how health is a system. And if you have more members in your family, you need to understand that they're a part of that system as well. This is for the parent that's in the deep throes of dealing with this for your own kids. This pod is also for the coach who's coaching parents. And there will be some things that I say that will be polarizing. There'll be some things that I admit are my opinion. There might even be some things that you're outraged at, but I hope that you'll look at this and what I say like the wounds of a friend. Shout out to Proverbs. Now, what this pod isn't going to be is I'm not going to point my finger at you and explain what nutrition is, because I imagine that if you're a smart, at a bare minimum, high school educated adult, you actually know what that means. You know deep down that you're supposed to eat real food. You know deep down that you're not supposed to eat so much that you're stuffed. You know deep down that there's a whole host of things out there that have synthetic chemical toxins in them, and that if you eat it, it's not going to go well for you long term. I imagine that you know all that. So this isn't going to be a lecture on what nutrition is, but we are going to go a layer deeper, because as I look around and as I've had challenges myself parenting children, specifically when it comes to nutrition, I realize that there's some underlying fears, there's some underlying assumptions that just aren't true. And if we don't address those, then we're going to be at this surface level talking about what's the best bar to give our kids, which isn't really the topic. It's not really the issue. So let's get into some of those unchecked fears and assumptions right now. Fear number one, being a parent, there is a fear that there will be this never-ending confrontation that you'll have with your kid. We're afraid that we're going to have to fight our kids on what they're eating forever. Now, nothing I'm going to say is really going to be like that much of a comfort, because the truth is that you will absolutely encounter confrontation with nutrition, and I think that that's unavoidable. But it will, like everything else in parenting, not last forever. We had a member that was a pediatric dietitian at Texas Children's Hospital. And her job was for these children that were malnutritioned or had a vitamin deficiency. Her job was to introduce foods for this child so they could be healthy. And I asked her, I said, what does the research say about the number of times that you should introduce something before you know you have to basically move on to something else? And she said that the research supports 22 times that you have to introduce something. I think about that a lot. I think about the resistance that I get sometimes with my own kids. I think about when I hear parents say, like, oh, my kid just won't eat this. And the words that come into my head is 22 times. Have you introduced it 22 times? I know for myself, there was a time where I was a kid, I proclaimed, I said that this would be forever, that I would never eat a hamburger. I remember the battle I had with my mom about not wanting to eat hamburgers. And looking back at that, you realize, like, man, even some of these confrontations, they're temporary. Things change for kids. Their taste buds change. My taste buds have evolved even as an adult. And so there isn't a great comforting thought there. But I think as parents, there's lots of things that we recognize, like, hey, there may be a confrontation, and that's okay. My kid and I don't always have to agree on every single thing. Fear number 2 is right in line with the unending confrontation, and it's a fear of not being in control. Let's get one thing straight. It's not your job to control your kid. And you say, but they're so little and I'm so big. It doesn't matter. If you have a kid that's over the age of 2, you know how little you can actually puppet master your child. You recognize that your job is to influence, set them up for success in lots of different situations, but that very rarely can you force them to do something. And if you do force it, it doesn't go very well. There isn't this education or understanding that what it is that they need to do is so necessary. So I don't think that you're being tasked with controlling them. And if that's true, it means that giving them hyper palatable food is just a way to try to do that. It's a way to try to pacify them. You may not have done that, but I've seen it very often. It's like, hey, go ahead and give them the goldfish. Hey, they must just be really tired. Why don't you give them this food? Like they're this animal in the zoo. The goldfish is a disposable binky. And I think that if you can remember that, you realize, like, okay, one, I can't control everything. I can't always use food as a way to pacify them. And as they reach a certain age, look, every parent gets how hard it is to try to take care of a kid. If you're worried about being a perfect parent, let me just help you out there and say it's impossible. But I think the goal is to try and to come up with different ways besides food that we can take care of them, but not control them. Fear number 3 is feeling like you're a slave to food preparation. In other words, you're afraid of wasting time. And again, I don't have an easy answer for this. The only thing I can say is that you signed up for several inconveniences when you decided to be a parent. And there's lots of other areas that you don't cut corners with. You don't let a 2-year-old brush their teeth themselves because you want them to have teeth. You buckle them up when you're in the car because you don't want them to fly through the windshield. You take time to prepare real food because you don't want to ruin their life when it comes to them having to kick these dependencies and addictions later. There are so many videos out there about how to hack things, about how to be efficient. There are some things in life that you don't want to be as efficient as possible. Quality time with someone, nutrition. These are things that take time, and your shortcut isn't actually doing the thing that you wished that it would do. Yes, in the short term, it's saving you some time, But in the long term, and the second and third order consequences of that is potentially going to be way more time consuming and way more involved on your part than the time that it takes to prepare food. Last fear is, I think, being a social leper. This is a fear of doing something socially, maybe at a birthday party, maybe when the grandparent hands the kid a piece of candy. In 100 different instances, you have two choices. You can always do the popular thing and suffer the consequences later, or be unpopular at times. We talk to our kids about this. We talk to our kids about how we aren't like everyone else, even people that they're related to. Yes, this requires paying attention, but you don't leave them in the pool by themselves. So at a certain age, you're lifeguarding them around these choices until they can create some autonomy on their own. One of the things that can help, that we'll get into in just a sec, is also premeditating and talking ahead of time about what the decisions are going to be. Because anybody that's put on the spot is probably going to have a hard time doing the thing that's right versus doing the thing that just feels socially appropriate. So in summary, before moving on, let's agree that as parents, or if you're coaching parents, that we need to make peace with a few things that we've set as an aspiration that we need to aspire to rather, and realize that some of that is just inappropriate. Some of that is unrealistic. Have in your mind that disagreeing with your kids and allowing that disagreement to happen is totally normal. Taking time to make food, which takes away from other things that you could be doing, is actually what you should be doing as a parent. Not always doing what's popular can be really cool, and it can be a badge of honor for your family. Now, this leads me to my next point. I have, at the time of this recording, 22 years of collective experience with pediatric nutrition. I have a 10, 7, and 5-year-old. And I can tell you that each is an individual, that what we thought would work for all three looked like a different journey and a different path of travel for each one. But despite those individual differences, everything I'm about to tell you has worked for all three. This has worked for several other parents and kids that I've spoken to. But nothing I'm about to say is easy. Nothing I'm about to say is a hack. Nothing I'm about to say is probably what you would find to be commonplace. The best I can figure, though, is that these first 10 years are pretty critical. As they get into double digits and as they're preteens and as they're teenagers, so much of what they will be experiencing will not be with you riding shotgun. So you might say in watching this video, well, what do you know, because your kids aren't that old? But I'm here to say in response to that by the time that my kids are not constantly in my presence, I completely trust them to make these decisions in the way that they should. So in these early years, I think there's two distinct phases. There is an education phase, and there's a phase of autonomy that leads into that period of preteen and teenage years. This first stage of education, I think, starts as soon as they are eating real food, and it probably lasts for most kids until they're around 6 or 7 years old. This is where you're setting an example first and foremost. When you think about the way that children acquire language, you're not sitting there with a pie chart out explaining sentence conjugation. They just learn it. And despite a few words that they, mispronounce, like, they're pretty dang good at just picking up what's happening in their environment. If that's true, there's a lot of other information that they're gathering. There's a lot of other intel that they are accumulating just by watching you. So before we go even further, understand that, man, maybe the hardest part of being a parent is just setting the example and setting the directive that you want your words to echo. If you are constantly on a diet, your kids will pick up on that. If food is a huge source of contention for you and your spouse, your kids will pick up on that. If food is something that is always a way for you to cope and reward yourself, your kids will pick up on that. Now, I don't think that there's any way to navigate parenthood without some bumps and bruises. And so, as we'll get into, having some dialogue around the choices that you're making so they don't assume something that's not true will also be really critical and I think paramount at the age appropriate time. The first thing to address is that there's no separate food. Yeah, when they're little, they're eating pureed shit and you're not. But the best you can, don't go down that slippery slope of saying that because they're tiny little humans, that they have different stomachs, priorities, or nutritional requirements than you do. That's totally bogus. I can show you the research to back that up, but you don't even need the research. That's common sense. I'm 6 times the size of my kids. And so if there is something that affects me, think about how much it's going to affect them. It's not the opposite. It's not, oh, they're kids. Oh, it doesn't matter. That's totally bogus. And if you're saying that, you haven't thought about it or you haven't really realized how silly that is. So step number 1, everybody's eating the same thing. Now, I want to remind you that some of that is cultural. If you go to other countries, there's no kids menu. If you go to other countries, there's no separate set of requirements for children. Everybody's just eating the same thing with an understanding that kids' palates aren't as robust as ours and that certain ingredients and even certain tolerances of quantity will be significantly different the smaller that you are. In this education phase, we're not only all eating the same thing, but we're eating it together. Yep, there are some things that I am advocating. That means that you have to spend time with your kids. There are some things that I'm advocating that means you have to be present during meals. It means that you can't be multitasking as food is being consumed, and even the preparation. We look at food and time together as a celebration. The girls help at almost every meal. As soon as they can stand up, as soon as their little hands can do things, they have become the sous chef. We have incorporated them into this process of preparing meals, and here's why. I want them to feel like they have some say-so in what's being cooked, in how it's being prepared. So when I serve the meal to them, I say, this is the meal that you prepared. That's a completely different ball game than arriving at the dinner table with food that you haven't seen until it slides right in front of you. Because for most kids, when they say they don't want something, what they're saying is, this looks disgusting. It's not, hey, I've really watched the process of this meal coming together and I understand the ingredients and I also participated and I know that the palette of ingredients that you combined won't be to my liking. It's really just like, hey, I had no heads up of what this is. And so what I'm telling you is I don't want to do something that doesn't look very fun. Incorporating the kids into the preparation is a game changer, in my opinion. We're making eggs. I say, hey, chef, what do you think? We need a little more salt on these eggs. What do you think? Are they cooked enough? We cook them a little bit more. And they're the ones that are calling the shots, even though we both know, like, I don't really need their help, and they're not really doing anything that's going to compromise like the taste of the food. Every meal is a conversation about what certain foods do. There's lots of questions about, like, hey, what is this? Is this a carbohydrate? Is this a fat? Is this a protein? Hey, daddy, is this good for you? Is a question that we often get. Hey, daddy, when I eat this, what will happen? And you don't need a master's degree in biochemistry to answer those questions. That's just silly common sense. But kids don't know that. And because you're in charge of their education, it's your responsibility to teach them about those things. And in this early stage, that's a constant dialogue that we're having around the meals that we're cooking, around times that we're eating out, around other social interactions with things that are new. And I think that's what the essence of this phase is all about. We talk about what makes them feel a certain way. We talk about what it feels like when they have too much. We talk about what it feels like if they don't have enough. We talk about how it's okay to feel hungry at times, that feeling of satiation or the feeling of a hunger pang doesn't mean that your life's about to come to an end. It's okay to feel some of these extremes. These kids will ask tough questions. A big question I get is, why do you drink so much of this? Why can't I have some of that? Why are you doing this, but I can't do this? And I would really be prepared for some of those questions. If you don't have a great answer, don't do the thing that our parents did where it's like, hey, it's just because I said so. Come up with a good reason why it is okay for you to have caffeine. Come up with a good reason for why you can have alcohol and they can't. Or you'll have this certain dessert and they won't. And if you don't have a great reason, I would really investigate if it's worth having to explain yourself over and over again. Back to one of those fears, it's a common conversation that we have that they will not like everything that we prepare for them, and that's okay. It is okay for them to tell us that they don't care for this food that we've prepared. We're constantly exposing them to new types of preparation for poultry, for seafood, for beef, vegetables, different ways of preparing all things together. And it's totally okay for them to give us feedback that they don't like it. We have a little jingle that makes them laugh where we say, I have to try new things because they might taste good. And whenever they say that, that's typically our response because they know, like, okay, some of this thing around nutrition is trial and error. In conjunction with that, though, it has been my experience that even if they revolt, even if they are rebelling against the hamburger or the salmon that you've prepared, they will eat. No parent ever starved their kid constantly preparing whole foods for them. 22 times. It takes time. They also don't have to clear their plate. We have what's called, and we're not the only one that does this, a no thank you bite. Hey, the way that this looks on the plate may not taste the way it actually is. I want you to try just one bite. And that consistently applied has got kids that we thought would never eat salad to love it, kids that we never thought would eat shrimp or salmon to love it, but it just takes time. Secondly, we believe that they should make mistakes. We believe that our kids should, in this educational period, be exposed to things that we don't think are good for them. And that's potentially a polarizing opinion. What that's predicated on is that, once again, we want to equip our kids to be strong enough to handle certain circumstances and in an amount that's appropriate and at an age that's appropriate. We want them to connect the dots between what really happens when they choose to make some of these decisions. I'll give you an example. Our oldest daughter, and she'll be embarrassed that I tell this story, was in disagreement that she had a dairy sensitivity. And so there was pizza, and she said, I think that I can eat this pizza and nothing will happen to me. And I said, okay, let's give it a try. And she ate the pizza. And later on, she's in her underwear and she's walking through the house and she chooses to trust a fart. And that fart turned into a shart. But in that moment, it was a wonderful educational chance for me to say, Stell, you're allergic to cheese. And we laugh about that all the time, but I think one of the responsibilities we have as parents is to connect the dots for them. We do this a lot. We're heading out to parties and we see kids losing their minds because of the unadulterated amounts of sugar that they're getting. And we always have an after-action report from those parties. Once upon a time, it was me initiating this conversation saying, man, did you see Jennifer? Did you see how she was acting? See how she just like spontaneously started crying and then she punched that kid? Why do you think that is? And they're like, I don't know. It's like, do you think it was because what she ate? Maybe so. Now, fast forward, when we're at a party, they'll lead those conversations. Be like, hey, did you see this kid and how they acted? And so over time, they can start to make new connections between things that at some point were probably very abstract to them with just more experience. Now, kids are kids. And again, because we've introduced these things to them in very controlled amounts, it's normal for our kids to ask us, hey, do you think that I could have this? One, if we're heading into a social situation, I will let them know what's about to happen. I will give them a heads up because I think nobody performs well without a heads up. So before we go to Mimi and Pops' house, before we go to a birthday party, before we're going out, I'll say, hey, at this party, we're not going to be eating this stuff that is going to be here on this table. I want to prepare your hearts for that. But I also want you to know that me saying no to that means that there is a yes to something later that's going to be even better. And that's a very common sentiment. Now, what is that? It's delayed gratification. The game that I'll play with them is to try to delay it as much as I possibly can. And to also surprise them. I'll say no 9 out of 10 times. But the thing that I say yes to is way better than the shitty cupcake that they could have had at the party. It's something that we make together. It's a delicacy of a French freshly baked Queen Amande. It's something that they know that when I'm saying no, it's not no in perpetuity. It's just no for right now. And with enough dialogue and enough conversation, that has become something that they trust Kelly and I with. And they know that I'm not trying to rip them off, but I'm trying to take care of them in that moment. The second phase is this phase of autonomy. And this is relatively new for Kelly and I. 2 out of 3 of our kids are in this phase. But this is where they can go to birthday parties without us. This is where they can be with grandma and granddad. And they don't need me making their choices for them. They have enough education. They have enough awareness about how they would rather feel good for longer than instantaneously, and they make these choices on their own. Before, when they said, do you think that I can have that? I would need to answer for them. I would need to say, no, I don't think that that's a good idea. Now, as they get older, they'll still ask that question, but my answer is now different. I say, what do you think? Do you think that would be a good idea? And I trust them. If they say yes, I will let them. If it's something that I know isn't good for them, I let them suffer the consequences, and I make sure that we have an after action report. When they spontaneously start crying themselves, I'll say, hey, why do you think that you're acting this way? And very gently and very graciously, we try to connect the dots back to how much nutrition has an influence on our digestion, our emotions, and even the way that we feel from a systemic or inflammatory standpoint. And all three of those things, ladies and gentlemen, a kid gets. All three of those sensations a kid can feel, and all three of those connections, I think, should be adamantly reinforced. What's been cool, and I don't think this is because I'm a perfect parent, but it's because these kids have been educated, that they're making these decisions on their own without me breathing down their neck and without me micromanaging them. And I can only assume that that's because, once again, they've equated that it's okay to be different. They would rather feel good for a long amount of time than just a short, very intense amount of time. And that this is just what mom and dad have taught us. The answer, in my opinion, to nutrition for kids is somewhere skewed along towards the edge of restriction and toward the edge of what society would say is unreasonable, but it's not all the way to the edge. There's some experiences that you want them to have. There's some things that you want them to celebrate. There's some things that you want them to have enough cursory understanding for that when they get to bigger and grander decisions that also feel like instant gratification, they'll have had so many opportunities to make the right choice that you can trust them with other things. I hope that you found this convicting. I hope that you don't discount it. Don't take your eye off the ball. This takes a constant amount of attention. It takes time, and it's not easy. But you didn't sign up for anything that was easy in the first place. Wherever you're at, I believe that you can improve it. Whatever you've done up to this point, whatever you inherited from your own parents, whatever you're assimilating to in your own little social circles, you can make some choices that are distinctly different. And you can do that with great confidence because you know it's in the interest of a kid that can't make these choices for themselves. This is the hardest thing ever. It's not easy, but your kid is worth it and their life depends on it. Thank you for listening.